United States has significantly reduced its consumption of coal since the early 2000s. In 2005, coal was used to generate about 50% of the U.S. electricity, but by 2021, only 19.8% of the nation's electricity was generated by coal. Renewables are expected to overtake coal as the world's top energy source by 2025. And there are three compelling reasons that the demand for coal as a fuel is declining dramatically around the world, according to our guest today, Jack Kerfoot, a scientist, energy expert, and the author of Fueling America, An Insider's Journey. Stay with us.
Welcome to Lean to the Left, home of no-holds-barred commentary, plus interviews with fascinating people, some of them top experts, others simply with interesting stories to tell. You'll never know who'll show up at Lean to the Left. Now here's your host, Bob Gaddy.
Jack, welcome to Lean to the Left. Thanks so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
Bob, it's always a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Yeah, I think this is what, number 4, I think maybe?
I think you're right, yes.
Yeah. You're my go-to guy on clean energy and climate change and all of that. So tell me this, Jack, is coal the same? Is all coal the same? And how is coal being used in the United States today?
I think the first question is absolutely a great question to start with, because people think that black coal is all the same, but there are actually 4 types of coal. And the types of coal are determined by the carbon content and the quantity of energy produced. Now, that should be important for people to understand because the quantity of energy produced impacts the amount of power, which means that how much it can generate as far as electricity in their household.
Okay.
Higher the carbon content, the greater quantity of greenhouse gas emissions, though, that are generated. Now, the most carbon-rich or highest carbon content coal is something called anthracite. It's basically, for a lump of coal right in front of you, would be 86 to 97% pure carbon.
Okay.
And the capacity is by far the greatest of any type of coal out there. Now, it's used in metallurgy where you need extremely high temperatures to make the product, whether it's titanium or a very high-grade quantity of steel. Anthracite sells for about $107 a ton, and that was in 2021, so the price has gone up significantly since then.
Okay.
It also demonstrates the fact that no fossil fuel is renewable, because the only place anthracite is mined is actually in Pennsylvania. It's been mined out everywhere else in the US and has been rapidly mined out in most of the other places in the world.
Wow.
The next level of coal, or as far as energy capacity, is what's called bituminous. And it generates between 45 up to maybe 80% of the content is carbon. And in 2021, 45% of the coal in the US was actually bituminous. It's mined for electricity generation, but also making steel and iron.
Okay.
And most of the coal, bituminous coal, is actually mined in the Northeast, in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Kentucky, and Indiana. And most of those mines, the vast majority of those mines, are subsurface mines.
Subsurface, did you say?
That's correct, yes. The mine shafts that go down. The pictures of the old coal miners coming out of the mines, up the rail cars covered in black soot, those are the type of coal mines we're talking about. So this type of coal in 2021 sold for over $61 per ton. Lower energy content, lower carbon content, so therefore it's less valuable. The next is what's called subbituminous, and its carbon content is even less, of course. It's about 35 to 44% of a lump of coal would be carbon. So 46% of the coal in the US that was mined in 2021 was subbituminous. That gets us over 90% of the coal in the US were these 2 types of coal. Now, this subbituminous is mined in open pit mines, primarily in places like Wyoming and Montana. And these are enormous mines. They are 20 to 25 square miles open pit mines that are mined with large machinery, bulldozers, and vehicles to mine it and to ship it out, primarily for electricity. That's the primary source of use or primary use of subbituminous coal. Now, it is plentiful, so because it's plentiful, the price is only $14 a ton.
Mhm.
But the reality is, as far as the consumer, thinking about your electric bill, because it's got lower carbon content, it takes far more of this coal to generate the same amount of electricity as a bituminous coal. So the
Okay.
cost for transportation and storage makes it more costly to transport and store than bituminous.
Okay.
And the last type of coal, which is lignite, which is the lowest carbon content, about 25% of a lump of coal to maybe 30% is lignite. So it's about 8% of the coal in the US is used for power generation, and it is primarily used or mined in places like North Dakota and Texas. It's really a localized market for coal to mitigate the cost for transport and shipping to the electric power plants.
Okay.
So those are basically the four types of power. And we've got to realize when we talk about electricity power generation in 2021, about 30 to 32% of the greenhouse gases in the United States were from coal and for fossil fuels in 2021. So moving away from coal, we can dramatically cut our greenhouse gas emissions as we move to nuclear and non-fossil fuels.
Okay, great. Thanks for that explanation. Now, in some of our previous shows, Jack, you explained that the type of fuel like coal or wind have advantages and disadvantages. What are some of those pros and cons when it comes to coal?
The primary coal pro is the fact that you can store a large volume of coal, up to 3 months of supply of fuel at one site. So the coal-fired power plants are high density and they can store a large quantity of coal, so they don't suffer from intermittency of power supply. Let's say like solar does, when the sun goes down at night, you lose your power source at night unless you've got battery storage. Now, the cons, on the other hand, are significant. First of all, economics, the cost to generate electricity from coal is 2 to 3 times more expensive than onshore wind or solar. Climate change generates the most amount of greenhouse gas emissions, significantly more than natural gas. In fact, coal generates 40 to 45% more greenhouse gas emissions than natural gas does, which is one of the reasons utilities over the last 20 years, based on economics and also based on emissions, have been moving from coal to natural gas, but also obviously to renewables as well. And finally, and this hasn't gotten much press, which is surprising, groundwater pollution. When you burn coal, you create coal ash.
Okay.
And that coal ash contains things like arsenic, mercury, and lead, which are all toxic. So the U.S. Environmental Agency requires that coal ash is stored in a secure area to ensure it doesn't wash and get into the groundwater. But yet the EPA in 2019 documented 241 cases where coal ash contamination had occurred in the United States from either active or recently closed coal-fired power plants.
What did it do?
So
Leak into the groundwater? Is that what happened?
that's exactly right. It leaks into the groundwater, which impacts, particularly if you're growing crops, you now have contamination from lead and arsenic and mercury,
Yeah.
or if you, and those, or grass, and that grass is then eaten by your cows or by your other animals in the area. So the impact on that coal ash can be significant to our daily food that we consume on a regular basis that we think is safe.
Okay. Jack, what's the difference in cost to generate electricity from coal compared to renewable sources like wind and solar?
There's a lot of discussion on what the costs are, but what's recognized is the most effective way to compare cost is to look at a levelized cost of energy, which we would call LCOE, levelized cost of energy. And what that means is it measures the lifetime cost of a utility scale power plant to build and to operate, and compare that divided by the amount of energy produced, the amount of electricity generated to the consumer. So the latest information I have, which is multiple sources, US government sources, and then a Lazard Bank has been doing a series of these over the last 15, 20 years. And these are for the US. The onshore cost for wind as of 2021 ranges from 2.6 cents to 5 cents per kilowatt hour. Now compare that to the average cost of residential electricity in the US right now. It's around 15 cents per kilowatt hour. So that's significantly less than the average cost of residential power. Solar ranges from 2.8 to 4.1 cents. Now, the reason you've got a range for those costs is wind consistency and magnitude of that wind will vary from region to region. And also different states have certain variable property taxes. So when you put a solar farm or a wind turbine on property, they have to pay property taxes for that. So based on that cost, that all factors into it as well.
Okay.
Now you compare that to coal, and actually the cost for coal now would probably be higher, but let's use this same frame of reference, 6.5 cents to 15.2 cents per kilowatt hour. So again, 2 to 3 times more expensive to generate the same amount of electricity if we're looking at the consumer. So
that's incredible.
That's another factor. The economics have been driving many of the utilities, especially in the Great Plains states, to actively develop wind and solar at a very rapid pace.
Now, have power sources that the U.S. electric utility used over the past 15 to 20 years, have they changed much during that period?
Well, we've gone over since 2005, a major transformation in our power grid.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll sometimes hear discussions on the news about a particular wind farm or a project people like or don't like. But the reality is the energy grid system across the US has changed dramatically. In 2005, talking about electricity generated in the US, coal generated 50% of the electricity in 2005.
Right.
Nuclear, 19%. Petroleum gases, which includes natural gas and propane and butane, about 19%.
Mm-hmm.
Renewables, including hydro, about 9%, and oil, 3%. So in places like Hawaii and certain places in the Northeast, they still use fuel oil or refined petroleum to generate their power. So in 2005, 3% was actually from oil. Now in 2021, what we see is natural gas and petroleum gases generate 39%. Coal generates 22%, renewables almost 20%, and then we've got nuclear at about 19%. Oil is only less than 1%. So we've had a major shift up in renewables and a major shift up in natural gas and a major drop in coal and also drop in oil as well.
Jack, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, coal, nuclear stayed about the same.
Okay. I just was wondering what's caused this dramatic change in the type of fuel used to generate electricity.
The way I would answer that question is start back with a key event in history. When I was in university many years ago in the mid 70s, we actually had oil embargoes on the US. And there was a shortage of oil, so cars were lined up for blocks just to buy 5 gallons of gas.
Yeah.
And people were concerned about the prime rate today. At that point in time, the prime rate went from 10% to 20%.
Yeah.
So we really did have inflation at that time.
For sure.
So energy security has been a major factor since the mid 70s for the US and the legislature. The other factors that started to happen is the obvious compelling data talking about global warming and the disappearance of the ice caps and major temperature increases and also increases in severe weather.
Mhm.
And so the global warming generates or produces climate change. So with all of this going on in 2005, the federal legislators were increasingly concerned about climate change for our nation and obviously the world, but also about energy security. In 2005, the price of oil was at that time extremely high at $56 a barrel and was forecast to go higher, which of course it did. In 2008, it topped at about $106 a barrel. So as a result, they had a bipartisan bill that was called the Energy Policy Act of 2005. And what that did was provide tax incentives to encourage domestic energy production, including renewable energy like wind and solar, nuclear power, clean coal, and oil and gas technology. Now, the tax incentives were designed to spur developments of new technology. And as a period of time, those tax incentives would consistently be reduced and eventually disappear. The idea was to generate that new technology and use the entrepreneurial capabilities of our country, develop new technology to generate higher capacity and ultimately reduce the cost of power. So the legislation did not have any significant impact to rejuvenate nuclear power. The problem with nuclear power is a huge amount of capital investment, 15 to 25 billion dollars for a power plant, and then the time frame to get that power plant from design to actual final approval is anywhere from 18 to 25 years, which is one reason we really haven't had any new nuclear power plants come online in the last 20 years. There's two plants in Georgia that will be coming on, but that's really the only new plants that we have on the immediate pipeline for large power plants. And there was no significant impact from clean coal, which I still refer to as an oxymoron. Uh, the
Yeah, is
legis-
some coal cleaner than other though?
it is, yes, we could argue that some is cleaner than others. It's
Yeah,
when many years ago, when I was working as a geophysical technician, I was in West Virginia,
yeah.
and I was renting a, a utility room or a room from a lady who had a very nice house, but it was in the backyard. And she said, "Now you're going to have to let one of my renters, after he comes off shift from the coal mines, use your shower because I don't want him coming in the house." And the guy would come home from work and he was literally covered head to toe in very fine black coal dust. And that was just about the time that they were starting to recognize black lung and the causes of coal onto the human body. So the good news is we've actually seen the improvements in wind technology and solar. And also there was the oil and gas industry that resulted in hydrofracking, which did increase the amount of oil production and gas production in the US. Now, those tax incentives encouraged people like the late T. Boone Pickens, who I had dinner with in 2006, to shift from oil and gas to wind. And when I had dinner with him, he was telling me about developing and building a massive wind farm in Texas and how this was going to revolutionize the power grid in the US and the advantages of it. So we had a very useful and productive dinner that night. And that really started me on the path toward focusing more on renewable energy and its importance.
You have to tell us how it came about that you had dinner with this guy.
I had just come back from Malaysia and we had some rather significant success there. And
Okay.
so I was a speaker at a conference or a Houston group dinner to talk about major significance in the energy industry. And then he was there to talk about wind. And so they put us together as speakers, they put us together, and I really enjoyed and enthralled by the stories, and we had a very good discussion. And we avoided discussing football because he was an avid Oklahoma State football fan, and I, of course, went to the University of Oklahoma, which a lot of states with schools like this, like in Oregon and Oregon State, they have these rivalries that go back for decades, if not a century.
Sure.
So we avoided football, and it was a wonderful evening and very exciting for me.
Okay. All right. Okay. Did you finish with your? I interrupted you. Did you finish with your explanation about that last question?
Just to help people understand that what the impact of those tax incentives were for wind, what happened was in 1999, the average capacity for a wind turbine was just a few hundred kilowatt hours. And in 2020, the average capacity for a wind turbine in the US was 2,750 kilowatt hours. And now you're getting out wind turbines in the offshore that are going to be 12,000 kilowatt hours and 25,000 kilowatt hours. We've seen the capital investment cost for wind turbines to go down, the operating costs to go down, and also using new technology like drones to improve operating efficiency. The other factor is before 2005, if you talked about power plants, natural gas, coal, you were really talking about the utilities investing in those power plants. So they would go to the state utility board and ask approval to increase taxpayer rates for the electricity so they could get the capital to fund the project, the gas project or the coal project. In 2020, over 70%, almost 75% of the wind projects and solar projects were developed by independent power producers. And they will go to the utility and say, if you give me a power purchase agreement for 15 or 20 years at a certain price, I will build this project to you and I'll lay the transmission lines to your grid. And you will just pay me for every kilowatt hour that my wind farm generates electricity or my solar project generates electricity. They get that signed, then they'll go to the bank and they'll ask for capital funding from that standpoint. Now, that's important to the consumer because the consumer never has to subsidize the utilities purchasing for the wind farm. So that again keeps the costs down. So from that standpoint, we've got more power producers, actually 3 times the amount of power producers today than we had before. And we're also driving down costs significantly.
Now, I just was wondering, with this war in the Ukraine, has Russia's invasion of Ukraine and embargoes caused European countries to activate inactive coal-fired power plants? And if so, which countries are the dominant users of coal, and what's being done about that?
When in February 2022, when Russia invaded the Ukraine,
Yeah.
that prompted a series of embargoes
Uh-huh.
on Russian exports and also imports by the European Union, the United Kingdom, the US, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. But what that really did was and then when they were going to slowly phase out their gas from Russia and oil from Russia, but then Russia, trying to negotiate out, started shutting off the gas. So that basically turned the energy grid system in Europe on its head. And they had to find alternatives because the reliability of that natural gas from Russia was no longer there, and they didn't want to continue to fund it. But we have to realize that fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, is a cornerstone for the Russian economy. In 2020, Russia exported $74 billion in crude oil, $48 billion in refined petroleum, $20 billion in natural gas, and $15 billion in coal. And all 40 to 50% of that was going to the EU, European Union, and Western Europe. So that caused a major uh, change and unsettling across that as well. Now, The way that Europe adjusted to this change, and it was a very dramatic change with winter coming on as well,
Mhm.
was they started to install liquefied natural gas terminals. They had a few, but they started to increase those and started importing. Countries like Germany, Greece, Italy, and the United Kingdom were able to do that relatively quickly and were able to increase LNG, liquefied natural gas imports from not only the Middle East and Africa, but also the United States, accelerating renewable energy project development. Solar is usually very quick, but the areas like Southern Europe were able to implement that very quickly. Wind usually takes a little longer, primarily because the grid installation and bringing all these components together. But again, in Denmark and Germany, they started to do that as well. They also, countries like Germany, which had just taken a position of eliminating nuclear power, decided to hold off on that decision. Now, their position on nuclear power was diametrically opposite to France. France sees nuclear as zero carbon generation, which is true. It also sees a very stable power source. And so, from their standpoint, they didn't want to be dependent on Russian natural gas or any fossil fuel because eventually it will be mined out or produced out. So they saw nuclear as their best alternative. Germany had been phasing that out, saying we're going to increase our renewable energy, but that's taken them more time than they thought. But they've been helped by a very mild winter.
Okay.
A few have maintained existing coal plants and used them as what I call peaker plants or peaker sources. When there's a certain surge in demand, such as a coal spell comes in, they can then reactivate those coal plants. But when we talk about the use of coal in Europe, it's really insignificant to one country in the world, and that's the People's Republic of China. They consumed in 2021 2.9 billion metric tons of coal, which represents about 51% of the total global coal consumption. So in 2021, China was producing, by their accounts, 30% of the world's greenhouse gases. Independent satellite data would estimate that number as closer to 40%. So they generate more greenhouse gas emission than the United States, Japan, Germany, South Korea, Canada, Australia, United Kingdom, France, Spain, Italy combined, and throw in a few more countries as well. So the biggest source of greenhouse gas emission is the People's Republic of China. So if you want to have an impact on cutting greenhouse gas emissions, don't buy products that are stamped made in the People's Republic of China. So the other factor that's concerning to me is their appetite for coal is increasing. They're maintaining these relatively low lignite power plants primarily they're going through a major economic crisis. And so to maintain jobs, they're putting people in these closed sometimes and reopening these depleted coal mines just so people can have jobs. I understand that narrative, but at the same time, we have to recognize that the impact as far as greenhouse gas emissions, it's getting worse and significantly worse at a much faster rate than people realize.
Jack, if coal is declining, if the demand for coal is declining in all these countries around the world, where is renewable energy development booming?
The answer is renewable is booming in every region in the world. That's the
Okay.
good news.
Okay.
But the details or the reasons actually is dependent by region. If we look at the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, there's a huge boom in solar development. Now, the primary drivers there are the fact that they want to have all their domestic energy on renewable energy with solar. And based on the amount of sunlight that they get, they can easily achieve this from that standpoint.
Okay.
The economic driver is their economy is tied to the export of oil and natural gas. So they want to preserve this as long as possible. In Africa, we're seeing countries like Burkina Faso, Rwanda, Uganda, which may have low percentages to have access to electricity, like 5%, 10%, 15%. developing solar mini grid systems across the rural areas and across these countries. Now, that's important. It's not just for light, it's primarily to run water pumps for agriculture, which is essential in sub Saharan Africa, and that may be subject to drought, which can basically cause devastating famine from the country. In Southeast Asia, you're seeing countries like Malaysia and Indonesia develop major solar projects. In Indonesia, there are several islands in Indonesia that are north and east of Singapore, a major industrial city, literally covering these islands that aren't really inhabited with solar panels and then laying cables to Singapore to sell them energy. Because Singapore is a very densely populated, highly industrialized island country. And so they really don't have the space or the environment to really install in their country wind turbines or solar projects from that standpoint that will make a significant difference. So as Indonesia and Malaysia build these solar projects, they're selling green energy to Singapore. In Europe, of course, we've got major booms in renewables accelerated by the Ukraine war, so they can move away from coal and also become energy independent and also prepare for next year's winter that might be a little harsher than this year's winter. In South America, we've got countries like Paraguay and Uruguay that are relatively small populations but have vast renewable energy resources, wind, but also hydro as well. And so they're actually selling power to larger countries like Brazil and Argentina. So in 2020, Paraguay actually generated for their country $1.7 billion in green energy sales to Argentina and to Brazil. And of course, in the US, we've got booming wind and solar in the Great Plains area. The east coast of the US, we've got wind farms being built right now from Massachusetts all the way down to North Carolina, and I expect we'll see those offshore wind farms continue along the East Coast, including down to Georgia and Florida. And we're also seeing in the Gulf of Mexico, states and utilities looking at offshore wind in the Gulf of Mexico. And finally, the West Coast is starting to look about implementing offshore wind from that standpoint, because offshore wind is stronger than onshore wind. So it's a higher source of power. So right now, the answer is it's booming everywhere. And I think it's very probable that zero carbon sources by 2030, including nuclear, wind, solar, geothermal, and hydro, that we may be very close to 50% or more by 2030 in 7 years.
Well, that sounds to me like it's good news.
I think it is.
Yeah.
We just need to keep pushing and support legislation to remove barriers for the development of projects and also support renewable energy as we move forward.
Jack, the other day, the Biden administration announced that it wants to impose strict restrictions on auto emissions, the most strict ever, in a bid to advance President Biden's climate agenda by forcing U.S. car companies to rapidly accelerate the transition to electric vehicles. What's your take on that?
The emissions restrictions that you're talking about is actually a plan that was initially put forward. And the idea is this: the largest source of emissions in the US is actually from transportation.
Yeah.
And the largest component of transportation, it's not airplanes and it's not ships and it's trucks, it's the automobile. So increasing the gas mileage and reduce emissions is absolutely, in my mind, the right step to move forward as far as moving toward a path of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and to achieve our goal and our commitment of the 2000 or the Paris Climate Accord. So from that standpoint, that makes sense. Now, I have an electric car. The only limitation that you're having right now in the electric cars, there's a lot of debate. But the CEO from General Motors came out 2 years ago and said by 2025, 2 years from now, The cost for an electric vehicle will be the same as a combustion engine vehicle, and the car will be able to drive at least 500 miles on a charge. And everything I'm reading says that we're on that path. The next big change will be when you can get a battery that you can get fully charged in 5 or 10 minutes. And when that happens, then the gas stations will start putting in those chargers, and you will drive your electric vehicle in, plug it in, and get a 50% or 100% charge in a few minutes, and go inside and spend your money on what the gas stations really want you to spend their money on, which is soft drinks and munchies and lottery tickets, and then come back in and drive out. So from your standpoint, to the consumer, there would be no change in the cost for the vehicle, no change in the amount of time you spend in a refueling or recharging station. The only thing you would see is much cheaper gasoline costs, much cheaper operating costs. I right now get about 3.1 miles per kilowatt hour. So to put that in perspective, for $1.10, I drive 31 miles. Okay. So you can double that and say I can drive 60 miles for $2.20. Now, I think you'd be hard pressed whether you're in Texas, South Carolina, or Oregon to get gas that cheap. And as we start to see the natural gas or the oil start to become depleted, we're going to see those prices continue to go up.
Yeah. Okay. Jack, I appreciate you taking the time to explain all this for us and for our listeners. It's a complicated topic, but it's extremely important. And we've talked about this a lot, and it seems to me that the world is really on the right path now. Jack, what prompted you? I think you might have told me this in our first episode, but you used to be an executive in the oil and gas industry, did you not?
Yes, that's right, I did. And I spent over 25 years overseas. And so, what my roles with different companies, I was recruited by different companies to work for them to
Yeah.
do startups and turnarounds. What that means is we have a problem and we can't find anyone inside, so let's hire the new guy. And if he can fix it, that's great. And if we can't, we can get rid of him without any worry. But that's all right. I like a challenge. But that provided me the opportunity to meet with people, leaders in different companies, whether it was Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia,
Yeah.
in Europe and the Netherlands, Australia, and talk about different energy issues. And so I think when I went to university, most of the people that were studying geophysics and geology were also members of the Sierra Club because we were all concerned not only uh, ensuring energy security for people, but also to do it in a way for a clean environment.
Okay.
But my discussion with T. Boone was the tipping point, if you want, where I started to focus more on that, simply because it's a factor of energy security, which is one factor I get most people to agree with. I haven't yet to have anyone tell me, even the most stringent climate denier, that they don't like to save money. And then we can talk about the climate. The question about the eroding or the disappearing ice caps is, I think, there's compelling evidence.
Mhm.
And then we're also starting to see, and this is another one that concerns me the most, is 1980 through 1999, 20-year period. This is a UN study. And they looked at the amount of severe weather, hurricanes, droughts, tornadoes, heat domes, or extreme heat waves around the world. And then they compared it from 2000 to 2019. And there was an 80% increase. So that to me, we may debate about the stochastic modeling about climate change and where it's going from that standpoint. And that stochastic models there is certainly uncertainty in that. You have to build it into your predictions. But the data from a look back standpoint about climate change, to my mind, is compelling and irrefutable.
Okay.
I'm a data guy, so give me the evidence and I'll be happy. Date a guy who's also went to law school. So
Okay.
show me the evidence and I'll go there.
All right. I have to assume that these jobs you had with these energy companies must have been pretty well paying jobs. All right. So you had this cushy job that you were making a lot of money in the oil and gas industry. And then you quit. I mean, was it a hard quit, or did you find some other soft landing spot, or what? What happened?
I became a consultant is what I did because effectively that's what I was a consultant.
All right.
But again, when you say the cushy job, you have to realize my work week was 80 plus hours a week. Okay.
I have to say, based on the amount of writing that you do now, that you haven't really relaxed much.
Let's just say I enjoy what I do, and my wife says I am a type A personality, so that goes without saying. Yes. So I
Okay.
had some wonderful times, and I had some wonderful stories with different people. It was a wonderful time, and there are many challenges that you don't realize, and you can take them as do it in a graceful way or in a teaching way. And one of the stories I like to tell is I had a young man that was working for me that came in with a request to go to a school on carbonate geology that was in the Bahamas. And he, what he would study of carbonate geology is a valid study, and the class actually was a wonderful class, but that wasn't what he was working on and wouldn't be working on. He was working on something very different environment. So he hands this to me, and I said, see, look out. My office window looked out into a parking lot in New Orleans. And I said, you see that little blue car over there? He goes, yeah, that blue piece of junk. I couldn't figure who owns that piece of junk car. I said, I'm the proud owner of that junk car. And I want you to know that I treat the company's money like I treat my money. And he goes, he just grabs it back, the request back, tears it out, and he said, you could have said no. And I said, and that wouldn't have been a teaching moment. So that was a great opportunity, and I had many other type of opportunities like that.
Okay, Jack. As always, it's fun talking to you, and as always, it's very informative. So, thanks a lot for being with us, my friend. I'm sure we'll catch up again.
I would look forward to it. Thank you, Bob.
I hope you enjoyed this Lean to the Left video and that you learned something as well. Please come back on a regular basis and check out our interviews with guests on topics that I hope you find interesting, entertaining, and enlightening. And you can check out the schedule of upcoming shows, guests, and topics at podcast.leantotheleft.net. You can also subscribe to our audio version there or to our video shows here at YouTube. And follow us on social media. Facebook at the Lean to the Left Podcast, Twitter at Lean to the Left 1, Instagram at BobGaddy_Lean to the Left, and TikTok at Lean to the Left. Our goal is to be informative and entertaining as we and our guests comment on the latest developments in the news and about the social issues that concern us all. This is Bob Gaddy signing off for Lean to the Left. Thanks for sharing your time with us.